is the director, and we'll be taking you through this morning's session. We're going to record the first part, so just the input, so we can share that with people who are not able to attend. If you want to switch your camera off, that's absolutely fantastic. If you want to ask any questions as we're going along, please feel free to put comments or questions in the chat, and we will come back to them towards the end. So in terms of the overview for this morning, we're going to start off just with a little bit of an introduction as to what gender budgeting is, just for those who've maybe not been to any of our sessions before, and then I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who'll take you through some of the kind of key areas that we identified during the budget review, and then I will pick up at the end. Just to say that in terms of the budget review, this is our third year of doing this, and this has been carried out using the publicly available papers on Council's website. So the papers that are sometimes there are papers that sit behind that councillors can access that aren't available to members of the public. But rather than going down the route of doing FOIs and things like that, we've basically undertaken this using those papers that are available publicly. The briefing for this is available on our website at the moment, and we'll put the link to that in the chat if anybody wants to have a look at it.
Heather, someone's in the chat just said they can't hear, so can just make sure everyone else can hear, and maybe it's something for the individual's computer.
I can hear you.
Great.
Yep, can hear you fine.
Great. Okay.
Amazing. That's great to know that I'm not talking to myself. Brilliant. So the person who's saying they can't hear, you may want to go out and come back in. That can sometimes sort sound problems.
Heather, I had that problem and I've gone out and come back in and it's fine.
Council.
Brilliant. So I'm going to start off with, just as I say, with a little bit of an introduction as to what gender budgeting is, just for those who may be in the room that haven't attended any of our sessions before and aren't 100% sure about what what gender budgeting entails. So basically, gender budgeting is a form of, it's a way of looking at and understanding the impact that the way that we raise money and spend money, how it impacts on different groups. It's about recognising that budgets are one of the key tools that governments have in terms of achieving their priorities. And gender budgeting is about taking a lens and carrying out a critical analysis that really asks the question, who benefits and who doesn't from the way that we raise money and spend money. And ultimately, at the heart of gender budgeting is about challenging the assumption that budgets are gender neutral, that they affect everybody the same. Now, one of the things that we found when we've carried out our budget review for the last 3 years is that you see that coming up time and time again, that decisions affect everyone in the same way. And the reality is that's just not true. So gender budgeting really asks us to carry out an analysis and to really think about, as I say, who benefits and who doesn't. From the way we raise money and the way that we spend money. And ultimately, one of the things that gender budgeting does, and is at the heart of it, is it challenges some of those established economic models which don't see unpaid care. So when we think about the work of Adam Smith and Keynes and things like that, unpaid care doesn't exist. It's as if there's fairies come in and do the washing and the child rearing and the cooking and things like that. And the reality is that that actually unpaid care is such a valuable. We couldn't run, society wouldn't run without unpaid care, but too often it's unseen, and that's often at the heart of women's inequality. And one of the things that gender budgeting does is it makes that visible. And it asks us to really consider how the way we do things impacts on that. I'm going to just show a short video at the moment, which just sets out where we are in Scotland. So it's a short animation that we have that just highlights kind of women's inequality in Scotland. And then I'll go on and just say a little bit more about gender budgeting. So here we go.
But for women, our economy. COVID-19 and cost of living crises have highlighted inequalities across our society. They have shown that our economy isn't working. But for women, our economy has never really worked. How money is raised and how money is spent impacts differently on men and women. This is because the gender norms, stereotypes, and expectations that impact on men and women are often unseen. Budgets at a national and local level can embed and entrench these inequalities, or can fail to address the systemic issues caused by these norms, stereotypes, and expectations. Gender budgeting asks the question about who benefits and who doesn't in relation to how money is raised and how money is spent. From cradle to grave, gender inequality in Scotland is still a major issue and impacts on women's life chances. Women are more likely to be living in poverty at all points of their life. This is due to women spending more of their time doing unpaid care work. As a result, women have less time for paid work and are more likely to work part-time or be in precarious employment. Caring responsibilities mean women are less able to travel for work, and public transport in Scotland does not meet women's needs, restricting job choices. Stereotypes about what men and women are good at impacts on the choices made about paid work. Work which is seen as women's work tends to be undervalued and low paid, which means women earn less per hour and less overall. This means women own less and are unable to save as much as men. Because women earn less and have caring responsibilities, women rely more on benefits and public services like public transport and childcare. Women are hardest hit by cuts to benefits and public services. Black, Asian, minority ethnic, and disabled women are hit hardest of all. Employers make assumptions about women's abilities and likely behaviours. Some women face discrimination in the workplace. Women's careers progress at a slower rate than men's because they spend more time caring. This is reflected in the gender pay gap. Women have less time to take part in politics and public life, meaning women are underrepresented in decision-making positions. The majority of MPs, MSPs, councillors, and other decision makers in Scotland are men. As a result, policies and laws are more likely to be based on men's needs. Inequalities based on gender intersect with other forms of inequality based on race, disability, class, age, sexuality, and gender identity. This means that inequality takes different forms and can be more severe for some women than others. In Scotland, women living in remote rural areas can face additional barriers. Women and girls experience violence and abuse caused as a result of attitudes and beliefs which are influenced by gender stereotypes and norms. This is a cause and consequence of economic inequality and poverty. Poverty makes it harder for women to leave an abusive partner. At the same time, violence against women and girls can affect women's ability to work or study, and thus their economic well-being. These inequalities are often unseen or unconsidered by people who make decisions at local and national level. Gender budgeting is an approach that can help us question and challenge some of the unseen biases within our system and help to ensure how we raise and spend money is equitable.
Okay, so as I say, that's just a short animation that kind of sets out, oh, we don't want to see that again, is the short animation that sets out where we are in some of the issues that we're trying to deal with when we think about women's inequality. So in terms of kind of some of the key principles of gender budgeting and the ones that we've used in the review are, gender budgeting encourages greater transparency around the budget process in terms of, one of the mantras around gender budget is being able to follow the money, to be able to understand what happens when money is transferred from central government to local government or to other public bodies and what then happens with it. But it's also very much a performance and results orientated approach. It's about outcomes. What is it that we're achieving as a result of in terms of how we raise money and spend money? What is it we're trying to achieve? So that transparency in terms of being able to follow where the money goes, how it's used, but importantly, what are we achieving by, what's happening as a result of the way that we use this money or the way that we raise the money? Ultimately, when we think about, the problems that as a society that we're trying to deal with at the moment in Scotland in a local and a national context. Inequality is often at the heart of these, but that inequality doesn't come about because of individuals and the mistakes or the failures of individuals. It comes about because of their systems and our structures and the failures within our systems. So gender budgeting is very much about thinking about the outcomes and the results that we're trying to achieve. Accountability and participation are at the heart of gender budgeting as well, and we'll look at that as we go through, because those are participation is one of the areas that we have looked at in relation to the review. Gender budgeting also encourages us to take that intersectional approach. We know data tells us time and time again that when we think about, the groups or, women as a group are often disadvantaged, but there are specific groups, so single parents, those from racialised minority communities, disabled women, those who, single households, those who live alone. So age can be often be a factor as well. So, we know, taking that intersectional approach and trying to understand and think about the impact that different characteristics have on people's lived experiences. It's about looking at the cumulative impact, but understanding how are the decisions that we are taking and how they piece together. What does that mean for people in the whole? Unfortunately, as public organisations, often we work in silos, but that's not how it impacts on people's lives. People don't live in the silos that we often work in. So it's about understanding the cumulative impact, and it's also about identifying the impact on other areas of services. If we make a change in one area, what does that mean further down the line? What does that mean for some other service? Are they going to end up having to pick up for it? Is it going to actually end up costing more? We may be balancing one part of the budget and the spreadsheet, but actually what does it mean in other areas of public the public sector, but also the third sector as well. So gender budgeting is about, as I say, at the heart of it, it's about that carrying out that critical analysis that really asks us to think about who benefits and who doesn't from the way that we do things. And on that note, I'm just going to share a quick video. Some of you may have seen this before, or if you've read Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, you'll have heard about it. It's the snow clearing example. And this is just a video that we show just to give an example of what about a gendered budget and approach is. One of the things that I would say, and I always kind of say this these days, is that we are not suggesting that we take this example and we implement it fully in Scotland, because people involved in snow clearing, when I show this video, always tell me that the snow in Scotland's different, and I'm not an expert in that, so I'm not going to argue with them. But the example is there to show you what we mean by a gendered budget and approach. So I'll show the video, and then we'll move on to talk about what we found in our budget review. So. Yeah.
Gender equality is a human right, but it is also a question of the efficiency and quality of public services. This film shows how gender mainstreaming can benefit not only individuals, but also municipalities, county councils, and others who deliver publicly funded services. It snows in Sweden, and after the snow falls, the municipality plows the streets and squares so that we can get through. What does this have to do with gender equality? Well, women walk, cycle, and use public transport to a greater extent than men, who travel more by car. This means that municipal snow removal has different consequences for men and for women. This is a form of gender inequality that we can put in figures. 3 times more pedestrians than motorists are injured in single vehicle accidents caused by icy roads. Most of them are women. Hospital care and lost productivity due to accidents in slippery conditions costs 4 times as much as winter road maintenance. In Karlskoga municipality, city officials analysed local snow removal from a gender perspective and found that typically male areas were prioritised. First, the ring roads were cleared, usually late at night when only a few trucks were passing through. Then, the major roads and streets were cleared, especially those leading to larger male-dominated workplaces. Last to be cleared were bus stops, pedestrian walkways and bike paths.
In other words, the municipality was prioritising snow removal for men above snow removal for women. This was not intentional, of course. They were just doing things the way they had always been done. To solve the problem, the municipality had to rethink its approach. 3 inches of snow are harder to get through on foot than in a car. So it was decided that pedestrian walkways and bike paths should be cleared before the streets. Infant schools were now given first priority, because that's where parents go first on the way to work. Larger workplaces were given second priority, but this time female-dominated workplaces, such as hospitals and municipal facilities, were also included. Pedestrian walkways and bike paths leading to schools were given priority 3. Only when this essential network had been made accessible were the remaining streets and roads cleared of snow. Working in this order resulted in no extra costs for the municipality, but it did make the allocation of resources more gender equal. It also made the city more accessible for everyone, especially children, for whom driving is not an option.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop that video there. As I say, that's just a video that we show to give an example of what a gender budget and approach entails. So in terms of the budget review, the principles that we use to review the budget papers were transparency, participation, outcome focused, and whether, in terms of advancing equality. So those were the 4 areas that we looked at. I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk about the first 3, and I'll come back in for the last one.
Thanks, Heather, and my sound will be coming through Heather, so hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So with regards to transparency, what we were looking for was initially how we could find information, but how accessible information on the budgets and the budget decisions were from the different local authorities. And similar to previous years, it was a mixed picture, but it was often a tricky picture. Often there's inaccessible websites which make it hard to find budget documents. That the budget decisions are within the committee papers, which are densely worded reports, that sometimes don't make it clear which proposals have finally been accepted and which ones may have been rejected. So yeah, a lack of kind of clear reporting on the final decisions. Often what local authorities have is information on their news pages. So a kind of a news release that goes out after the budget decisions have been made. And while this is a necessary part of reporting council business, it often does have a bit of a slant to it, with the positive spin reporting the good side of the budget decisions, but potentially not being as clear as might be desired for people like us on where the savings and where the difficult decisions were made. So ideally what we would be wanting to see, and we saw some examples of this in some local authorities in Scotland, would be a dedicated information page to the budget with clear information that's given on key budget information that's given in a relatable way so that people are able to understand what is being meant by these large numbers. And we pulled out in our budget review, if people have seen previous years, we do pull out good examples of where we think there's something that's working and could be built upon. So we saw good examples in Falkirk and Renfrewshire this year of dedicated pages that were making that effort to provide kind of information that's directly audiences as the citizens of the local area. The OECD has also been looking at these kind of communication principles and how to, and the challenges that anyone trying to communicate these kind of large budgets, government budgets are facing, and recognising that it is difficult to get across these kind of big numbers and the problems that are being looked at in a human and household level, especially trying to relate the budgets to the vast areas that local authorities are looking at in terms of social care, education, child protection. So the OECD, and there's a link in the briefing paper to this, because it's emerging work from them and will be developing in the coming months as well. But they recommend the use of visuals, of short stories, just looking at ways that can try and make these relatable. And it is difficult for those who are the closest to the budget to necessarily think about the communication, but they need to try and avoid using jargon. And within jargon, we also would say what's maybe termed kind of council terms, things that everyone in the council may be used to, but for those out and about on the street are less useful, are yet less used to. So just kind of challenging yourselves around that language. Next slide, I think. Just before going on to this part, within transparency, we've also looked at a few different areas that came out, and one of them that we draw out a bit is around operational savings, which are mentioned in many budget papers, but without too much details. And these kind of savings can be a variety of things like efficiency savings, that might be a departmental percentage of savings, savings that are viewed more as operational business of the local authority. And these are often decisions that are delegated to senior council staff. Best practice would see that the details of these kind of savings are also outlined within budget papers and budget information to provide that transparency both to councillors and to the wider public. And what we found in the review that of the 22 local authorities that highlighted operational savings in their budget papers, 6 of them gave no details of what these would be. So we'd like to see more around that detail, and one good example of providing that detail was Midlothian Council, which outlined the amount of operational savings predicted and the exact areas these would come from, to make sure that information on all types of savings is clear. And within transparency, we also gave some special consideration around what was within budget papers on integration joint boards. And this is an area we've been thinking about a lot at Scottish Women's Budget Group over the last few years, and we've worked with partners in areas where there's been particular challenges around funding for integration joint boards. And our review sees what I don't think will be a surprise to anyone on the call, but the council papers are being very clear about the stark financial pressures that IGBs are facing, and that many local authorities were reporting their budget gaps within the IGBs, which remain unresolved, and that reserve levels for IGBs are minimal. There's also reporting of overspends in the previous financial year as well. A small number of local authorities reported that they would need to increase funding to IGBs beyond Scottish Government provisions to manage these previous year shortfalls or budget gaps in the coming year. And for those that provided detail on IGB finances, the need for budget savings within IGBs as well was evident across the board. However, there was very little detail on what these savings might be. And for the majority, the kind of delegated authority to IGBs left decision making in that space and left any details in that space. So budget papers often had a variation of the statement. It will be for the IGB itself to determine how to balance its budget. And in some cases, it appears there was little consideration within the budget papers of the funding required to deliver statutory duties that are delegated to IGBs. This is concerning both in terms of ensuring that statutory services that statutory duties are met, but also from the transparency and accountability point of view, with full details of savings and potential increases of charges not known at the time that the council budget is set. So there's no way of knowing the kind of cumulative impact of savings being set within the council budget and the IGB budget at the time that the council is making their decisions. And we find that very concerning, particularly from the gender point of view, with care and unpaid care, and the majority of unpaid care work being undertaken by women. So if savings are being made in areas that increase the amount of unpaid care, both in areas that are under the council's main authority, for example, around childcare, but also then the IGBs are making decisions that are potentially reducing access to social care, again, increasing unpaid care. These two elements are not being considered at the same time, and that kind of cumulative impact that it could have, particularly on women's inequality, is not being seen. So that's the key area that we wanted to highlight this year in terms of IGBs. Moving on now to consider participation within the budget process. And in gender budgeting and other progressive budgeting, such as human rights budgeting, people's participation is a key principle, as Heather was highlighting. It's a key principle for good budgeting and supporting clear decision making. And what we've been looking for in our review is evidence of a consultation taking place, how it was conducted, who was heard from and how this influenced their views, and finally, what evidence there is of how the consultation has informed decision-making process. So you'll see on the screen the kind of the numbers we found within our review, and 23 local authorities ran a budget consultation ahead of making their budget decisions, with one further local authority highlighting that a multi-year consultation had been held previously. Of these 20 were published. And then what we want to look at was who was heard from within it. So 11 of the 23 collected demographic information to understand who they were hearing from within the consultation. And then within that, 4 of those attempted to use that demographic information to disaggregate their results to some extent. And of them, a couple, I think it was a couple of them that really looked in more detail at the protected characteristic of sex. So, for example, Murray, who disaggregated their data, showed that female respondents placed a greater value on adult social work services and additional sport needs service provision, while male respondents placed greater value on sports and culture and economic growth and development. In Dundee, where they provided a demographic breakdown for every protected characteristic, they showed what the different groups of people felt, how they felt different proposals would impact them. So within this, it highlighted that expected saving proposals around education and childcare, the protected characteristics of sex, women felt there was slightly higher than average impact on them within these areas, while men anticipated a lower than average impact on them. And for those with the protected characteristic around pregnancy and maternity, they highlighted an even higher than expected impact around savings in the education and childcare kind of field. And so this demonstrates the kind of where different impacts will be felt of saving proposals and who is most likely to be impacted. And on areas such as Dundee, where they disaggregated and showed the impact across all protected characteristics, there could be an opportunity there to also look further from the data they've got to understand how the intersections of some people's protected characteristics might link. So, for example, taking a saving where you could be particularly concerned that it might have a particular impact on disabled women, you could look and dig down into the detail about what the disabled women who responded to the consultation say, and does that lead you to consider further mitigations on the proposals that are being made? The further element that's key to us in participation is not just that this process is carried out, but it's then used to influence the decision, so that it's clearly articulated within budget papers, but also you can see how it's being used to support decision making. I think Stirling Council was quite clear in this information on how its consultation process had informed the decision making, and demonstrating both savings that had been considered that weren't accepted, as well as those that were approved. Stirling also demonstrated a two-stage consultation process, because we understand it can be quite difficult. The timeframes for local authority budgets are quite difficult, especially next year, knowing with the late Scottish budget and knowing what savings will be looked at to have the time to do the consultation process. But this two-stage process gave Stirling more time to understand what people were looking for, with step one seeking views on council services more broadly, and then stage two gathering responses on detailed proposals on ways to save and raise money. So that allowed them to take a bit more time and to hear from more people through the process. And finally, from my side, we also looked at the outcome-focused nature of budgets. So, as Heather said, this is important from the gender budgeting point of view, that we link the way money is raised and how it's spent to achieving agreed outcomes and priorities that we might have, and to highlight that within budget papers, and to be clear how the decision making are driving those kind of are being driven by those outcomes. So 22 councils made some reference to a council plan or other documents that set out priorities. And of these, there was a small number of cases where local authorities went on to detail a bit more about the priorities, and we're also really clear about how certain spending decisions were particularly focused on priorities. For example, in Murray, there was detail around some use of earmarked reserves to support a key priority area. And in Highland, there was some additional investment guided by the My Future Highland programme. And other local authorities had similar elements where they were demonstrating that the priorities that had been set were guiding certain decision making around the finances. Unfortunately, in terms of like a nationwide look at what's guiding our outcomes, no council considered the impact of the National Performance Framework. And with this framework now under review, it possibly offers a bit of a new opportunity to see how the refreshed National Performance Framework can, and the national outcomes that are with it, can work better with local government and national government, so it can be used to support the decision making at a local level as well, and support how the levels of priority fit with each other. And we share within the review kind of work that was done last year by Carnegie that was looking at this issue to do with the National Performance Framework and how it could be used to better support decision making. So I suppose around that is to look for what might come next with a refreshed National Performance Framework and how that can fit within this outcome focused nature for local budgets as well. With that, I'll hand back to Heather.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to take the section on looking at kind of advancing equality. And we've started off with this quote, if you like, in terms of, given that all councils within their papers absolutely recognise that there are difficult choices need to be made because of the financial pressures that they're experiencing. For us, one of the things that we would be saying and encouraging is that if we are to ensure that we are making the best use of resources, is that we need to make sure that there is that equality lens, that there's that we really kind of consider how the way that we are currently do things is driving demand for services, and what we can do to try and reduce that, but also to make sure that the decisions that we're making aren't further baking in that inequality, which will drive demand in the future and and further costs for individuals, but also for the public purse. One of the things that we looked at in the budget papers was where equality is considered as an actual risk in the within the kind of risk management framework, if you like, in terms of the risk matrix that councils use. And while all budget papers had some reference to equality impact assessments and the public sector equality duty, there was very few councils who actually specifically identified inequality as a risk to balancing their budget. One of the councils who did do that was one of the Ayrshires, North Ayrshire, who explicitly considered inequality as a risk factor in being able to set a balanced budget, and recognising that inequality, and if we don't address inequality, then that impacts on demand and it impacts on the ability to deliver services. They were one of very few local authorities who actually explicitly, as I say, considered inequality as a risk factor, and I think that's something that that we would be encouraging. Is that yes, there's a public sector equality duty, and there's the duties that councils have under that, but really kind of thinking about as a risk factor in terms of what's driving increasing costs, increasing demands, is really considering inequalities from that perspective. As I said, one of the kind of public sector equality duty and the general duties on councils to advance equality, to foster good relations, and the prevention of discrimination and harassment. These were mentioned often at the end of budget papers, as is the kind of template that is often there within council papers. It was, for many, it was considered, and they within, so it was considered within that kind of framework. But it was sometimes difficult to really kind of understand or to see how those equalities considerations were being used to drive kind of budget decisions. And the way that most local authorities kind of considered this was through the use of impact assessments, whether they were integrated impact assessments or equality impact assessments of their own. Of the 32 local authorities that we looked at, 12 local authorities had published impact assessments along with their budget papers, and a further 7 stated in their budget papers that they had been completed, but they weren't publicly available. And of those who did publish their impact assessments, and we were able to have a look at them, 7 had undertaken some form of gendered analysis in at least one of their impact assessments. So in terms of looking at the impact of the proposals on the basis of sex, we could see that in 7 of the councils. And I suppose in some respects that's slightly disappointing, because all councils or majority of councils made some change to things that were clearly gendered, whether that was around kind of education, whether it was around early years and childcare, additional support needs, school crossing patrollers, school transport. All of these things have an impact on unpaid care. Yet often that was missing from the analysis. And I suppose similarly to last year, one of the things that we would say is that from our review is that women continue to be invisible in plain sight, and unpaid care is invisible in plain sight, and that we need to, if we're to truly understand the impact that decisions are having, we need to make sure that we're making that visible. There were some elements of kind of, I suppose, good practice in terms of you know, kind of considering those kind of gendered considerations. So Aberdeen, for instance, within one of their proposals, which was changes to equality funding, were able to show that the impact that would have in terms of like shop mobility services, and highlighted a kind of gendered understanding of that, and that change did not, wasn't approved and didn't go ahead. So there were some examples of it, but it was often sporadic. There wasn't any one where you could say you looked at all impact assessments and you could understand and see how that gendered lens had been taken into them. But in 7, in at least one analysis, there was some kind of gendered lens had been taken. Again, this year within the budget papers, we continued to see budget papers noting that full impact assessments will be carried out following the budget decision. Now, we absolutely understand that because of the timescales often that are involved in the budget processes, that it may be difficult to do an impact assessment of the decisions. But again, we have concerns that in terms of councils meeting their duties under the public sector equality duty, and we have seen judicial reviews being taken because of impact assessments not being carried out, and consultation not being carried out, that there's a concern that that not considering that at the point of before the decision is being taken could lead to inequalities being baked into our systems. So while we absolutely understand that timescales are difficult, it really is, there's an absolute imperative that some form of an impact assessment, at least an initial impact assessment, is carried out ahead of a budget decision being taken. And yes, that can be updated, and and it should be updated as we go along. Impact assessments should not be a one and done. It should be a continuous process where we're looking at the data and what it tells us. So while there was some elements of good practice there, we did continue to see issues in relation to impact assessments. And I've mentioned, that failure to see women in unpaid care. Unfortunately, we continue to see that women's roles as unpaid carers is invisible in policy making. But also what's invisible is that joining the dots in terms of what our priorities are, what we're trying to achieve. So if we think about one of the key priorities in Scotland is addressing child poverty, unpaid care and the impact that has on women's inequality, and therefore the knock-on impact in terms of child poverty, is often unseen. So the role that unpaid care and women's roles within that, how that impacts on, as I say, in terms of these kind of national kind of priorities, continues to be seen, or not to be seen, and it's something that we absolutely need to be getting, I suppose, better at, is really understanding. In terms of our priorities, whether that's about growing the local economy, whether that's about our local authorities being good places to live and work, or whether it's about addressing inequality and poverty, unpaid care is absolutely something that needs to be taken into account. And unfortunately, we continue to see it not being considered at a kind of systemic kind of level, if you like. The other thing that came out this year, and we've put a quote there from the Accounts Commission from last year, is that within the kind of budget paper, sometimes it's difficult to to see clearly from the figures or from the papers about the savings that how the savings that are being said are going to be made will actually happen. There can often be a kind of lack of detail in terms of the numbers or the assumptions that sit behind the savings that are being, or the increase in charges that are the additional funding that's coming in. And one of the things that we would be encouraging is that we need to be better at showing our workings and enabling people to kind of follow the money, whether that be elected members or whether that be members of the public, in terms of really understanding that this is the level of savings that we think we will make from this, and this is why we think we will make it. When we looked at the budget papers for 25 to 26, you could see that there was, there had been reports made to council saying that actually the planned savings in 24-25 won't be made, or they won't be fully made, often for a variety of reasons, because the attrition rate hadn't been as high as had been planned, changes that had been built in were taking longer to implement, and therefore the savings weren't being accrued at the level that had been suggested. So there is something about often when you can sometimes look at the budget papers, it can seem like it's about balancing the numbers in the spreadsheet without having any faith that actually those numbers have true meaning. So I think, in terms of the information that's provided, both from a transparency perspective, but also for elected members in terms of being able to make good decisions, those workings, if you like, those assumptions and that sit behind are really important to make sure that the savings that we're saying can be made are actually realistic, and that we can have faith that they will actually be able to be achieved. This year, one of the things that we looked at was council tax. So all 32 local authorities increased council tax this year. Of those, 7 local authorities carried out an impact assessment on the increase of council tax. And of the 7 who carried out an impact assessment, 2 identified that women could be disproportionately impacted, both positively and negatively. So in terms of the negatively, and the fact that women are often on lower incomes, and therefore the financial impact of the increase could be disproportionately felt by them, because council tax is a regressive form of taxation. But also positively in the fact that the additional income that came in from council tax was allowing the continuation of services, and as we know, women often rely on and use services more so. So they were able to identify both positive and negative. What I would say, what would have strengthened that would have been if an impact assessment had been carried out of the investment decisions, to be able to actually show that the areas that the additional council tax is being used to fund had a direct kind of gendered kind of impact. But that's what we would say that was something that we would kind of recommend in terms of how you kind of bring that together in terms of that cumulative impact assessment. So in terms of charges and fees, which was the other area that we looked at, so 29 local authorities from the papers said that they were increasing charges and fees. The other 3, it wasn't clear from their budget papers if they were increasing charges or not. But of the 29 that we were able to see, it's one of the things that would say from a transparency perspective in relation to charges and fees, you can clearly see in the figures that are produced the grant that comes from the Scottish Government. You can see the money that councils expect to bring in from council tax and rates, non-domestic rates. What you can't see often in the budget, though, is how much they expect to bring in from charges and fees. So there's an issue there, I suppose, in terms of transparency. I think there's also an element in terms of when charges and fees are being increased about actually how much do we expect to bring in, how much extra do we expect to bring in from that, and being clear about that. Of the 29 who increased charges and fees this year, 13 included some information on the additional income that was projected to raise. In terms of impact assessments, 12 local authorities carried out an impact assessment on the decision to increase charges and fees. However, most of those who undertook assessments carried it out as one assessment related to all charges. And while we're not suggesting that there should be an impact assessment carried out on every charge and fee that's increased, there are some that we would be saying actually there potentially does need to be a greater, equality lens kind of taken to it to really understand how that will impact. And the figures that we've got there in the graphic to the side, so one local authority had made the decision not to leave charges for creative learning, for electric car charging points, and charges for overstaying at those remain static, while allotment fees for over 60s increased by 25%, sexual entertainment licences increased by 5%, while charges for daycare increased by 116%. And there was no impact assessment taken of any of those increases in charges and fees. And I suppose that just highlights that, that for us, I suppose it's about that duty to advance equality when we're not kind of taking that lens to charges and fees and not kind of considering, doing an equality impact assessment to try and identify who's going to be affected by this and what are the potential mitigations that might be needed. Then actually you're baking, potentially baking inequality into that system. And the other area that we looked at was, areas for investment. So some councils made decisions to invest more money in certain areas, but we found that very few carried out any kind of impact assessment of that. And the information about why those were areas that were considered to be priorities wasn't always clear. And I suppose it's that thing about about understanding and about transparency and communicating, what is the council's priority, and what are the elected members who are making the decisions, what are their priorities and why are those their priorities, and about understanding, if we invest in one thing, then that means there's something else that we can't invest in. And what's the trade-off to that? What's the opportunity cost potentially? And we would be keen to see a bit more kind of consideration or kind of communication of that within the kind of budget process, and the way that information is communicated, particularly in relation to ensuring that we are, making the best use of finite resources, and that that we're clear about what are the outcomes that we expect to come from this investment, and how do we ensure that. So finally, just in terms of from an equality perspective, we would be keen to see, and I suppose in terms of from a good practice perspective, cumulative impact. So thinking about how do all of these proposals work to, impact on different groups. Often impact assessments are carried out on a proposal. So the cumulative impact assessment encourages us to really think about how does one change in this area and another change in that area, how does that impact on those with protected characteristics? 9 out of the 32 local authorities carried out a cumulative impact assessment on the full set of saving proposals within the budget papers. There was none that looked at savings, charges and investment. So actually the budget as a whole, that was missing. And two local authorities identified through their cumulative assessment that women were likely to be disproportionately impacted by budget savings. So when we kind of look at the kind of cumulative impact assessment, one of the issues often as well is that because the initial impact assessments aren't identifying sex as a protected characteristic that can be impacted, it then means that's missing from the cumulative impact assessment. One example that we'd say of good practice this year was in relation to Orkney's cumulative assessment, which showed a good consideration of women's greater risk of poverty in relation to care and part-time work. And Edinburgh and their cumulative impact assessment recognised that while women could be negatively impacted by council tax increase and other things, investment decisions made as a result of the income generated could be there could be a net positive benefit for women. So really kind of thinking about how and I suppose Sarah mentioned earlier about operational savings as well, is how does the cumulative impact of the budget altogether, who is that likely to be impacting and who's benefiting, who's not? What are the mitigations that maybe need to be put in place and that we need to consider as an important part of it? And I suppose we will just the kind of recommendations. And I suppose these aren't necessarily recommendations, they're more kind of questions or kind of good practice that we would be encouraging all councils to consider and to think about in terms of, how does your budget process do this? If you're carrying out a consultation, are you publishing, are you making that publicly available? How are you being clear in your papers how that information is being used to inform your budget proposals decisions? Are you, when you're thinking about how you will monitor the impact of your budget, are you purely thinking about